Ray Township, Michigan. A quiet community where neighbors knew each other by name, where the loudest noise on a weeknight was usually the hum of passing cars or the laughter of kids playing outside. It was the kind of place where people believed tragedy belonged on the evening news, not on their own front lawns. But on the night of October 6, 2018, that illusion of safety was shattered in the most terrifying way imaginable. Just after 9:30 p.m., the calm of the neighborhood was pierced by a chilling 911 call. The voice on the line was frantic, heavy with fear. "My wife's been shot." The dispatcher froze for a moment, trying to grasp the urgency of the situation. Before they could fully process the call, another line lit up. This time, it was a completely different household. "Somebody's shooting at our house." Two separate calls. Two separate emergencies. One dispatcher, caught in the middle, trying to make sense of the chaos. At first, it seemed impossible. Two shootings unfolding at the same exact time, just a few blocks apart. Could there really be two gunmen terrorizing the neighborhood? Or was there something darker connecting both calls? Police units were immediately dispatched. Sirens wailed through the once quiet streets as neighbors peeked through their blinds, unsure of what was happening. Some thought it was just fireworks. Others quickly realized this was something far more dangerous. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene of the first call. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. Their eyes immediately landed on a Jeep parked haphazardly in the driveway. And then, a man stepped out. His clothes were stained, his hands shaking, his face pale under the streetlights. His name was Matthew Lewinsky. As police cautiously approached, Matthew's voice cracked with desperation. He tried to explain, but his words were frantic, almost incoherent. Inside the Jeep, officers spotted movement. A woman, bleeding, slumped over, her breath shallow. Her name was Kimberly, Matthew's wife. The officers rushed to pull her from the vehicle, dragging her to safety as blood soaked through her clothes. She had been shot, and her life was hanging by a thread. But before anyone could even fully process the horror of that moment, more gunfire echoed through the neighborhood. This wasn't over. Not even close. At nearly the same time Kimberly was being carried to safety, another group of officers responded to the second 911 call. They raced toward a home not far from the first scene. Their weapons were drawn, adrenaline surging through their veins. That's when they spotted him. A man standing in the yard, clutching a firearm, his leg bleeding heavily. His name was Daniel. Despite his injury, he refused to put the gun down. Officers shouted commands, but his eyes were wild, his chest heaving with rage and pain. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Two men. Two weapons. One woman bleeding out in the middle of it all. Back at the first scene, Matthew was quickly detained. To the officers, he seemed like the obvious suspect. His wife had been shot, and he was the one standing outside the Jeep. But the bigger picture was still hazy. Why was Daniel armed at the same time, just a few houses away? Neighbors were starting to gather outside, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered that Matthew and Kimberly had been having problems for years. Others claimed Daniel had always been too close to Kimberly. Nobody knew the full truth, but everyone could sense this was more than just a random act of violence. By now, ambulances were pulling in, racing against time to save Kimberly's life. But the story was already spiraling into something far more complicated than a single shooting. As police secured the area, they realized the situation was layered with contradictions. Matthew insisted he was only trying to protect himself. Daniel, bleeding and furious, shouted that he had been the one ambushed. And then there was Kimberly, unconscious, unable to tell her side of the story. The dispatcher who had taken those back-to-back calls earlier couldn't shake the eerie coincidence. Two men, both connected to the same woman, both involved in shootings within minutes of each other. It was the kind of scenario straight out of a nightmare. Officers knew one thing for certain: this was not an accident. This was personal. And as they pieced together the chaotic first moments of that night, a disturbing reality began to sink in. The quiet little town of Ray was about to be pulled into one of the most twisted and heartbreaking cases it had ever seen. Because beneath the flashing lights, the blood-soaked clothes, and the desperate screams for help, there were secrets. Secrets that had been festering for years. Secrets that were about to explode into the open, destroying everything in their path. The night chaos erupted was just the beginning. The flashing lights painted the neighborhood red and blue, but even with police swarming the area, the danger wasn't over. In fact, things were about to get even worse. Kimberly lay bleeding in the back of the Jeep when officers dragged her out, their hands slipping against her blood-soaked clothes. They pressed down on her wounds, shouting for medics. Neighbors huddled behind fences and windows, whispering in shock. A woman who had been smiling and laughing in her front yard just days before was now clinging to life in the arms of police. And while officers were trying desperately to save her, gunfire still echoed nearby. The second emergency was unfolding at Daniel's house. When police arrived at his property, they found him stumbling, his left leg bleeding heavily. The wound slowed him, but it didn't stop him from gripping his weapon tightly. His face was twisted in fury, his breathing sharp and ragged. "Drop the gun!" officers yelled. But Daniel didn't move. His voice was strained, almost broken, as he shouted back that he'd been attacked. That someone had come to his home, firing at him first. To him, holding on to the gun was the only way to survive. The standoff didn't last long. Officers rushed him, tackling him to the ground. His weapon was stripped from his hands as he groaned in pain, his injured leg giving way beneath him. He was handcuffed and taken into custody, blood seeping through his jeans. Now, within the span of just 20 minutes, 2 men had been detained, both connected to the same woman. One was her husband. The other, a man who had once been far more than just a family friend. As paramedics raced Kimberly to the hospital, police began piecing together the wild puzzle. The first assumption was simple: Matthew had shot his wife. But then, why was Daniel also armed and injured? Why had he been calling 911 at almost the exact same time? The deeper officers looked, the more tangled the case became. Meanwhile, families of both men began arriving at the scene, their words adding even more confusion. Daniel's mother was the first to speak. Tearful, defensive, and visibly shaken, she insisted her son wasn't the aggressor. In her eyes, Daniel had been the victim all along, ambushed at his own home, forced to defend himself against an enraged husband. "Matthew came looking for him," she told police. "He's the one who started this. My son had no choice." But then came another voice, Gabrielle, Daniel's daughter. She had grown up knowing both Daniel and Kimberly, and her version of events was just as passionate as her grandmother's. She described Kimberly as the woman who had been in her father's life for years, someone who meant more to him than just a casual friend. And now, she insisted, Matthew's jealousy had turned deadly. To officers on the scene, it was a storm of accusations. One family was pointing fingers at Matthew. The other side was pointing back at Daniel. Both stories were delivered with raw emotion, but neither could be taken at face value. The question remained, what had really happened in the minutes leading up to Kimberly's shooting? As detectives interviewed Matthew, his words were frantic. He insisted that Daniel had been the one stalking him and Kimberly. That Daniel had fired first, leaving Matthew no choice but to respond. But across town, Daniel was telling the exact opposite story. From his hospital bed, he claimed Matthew had shown up at his house armed, dragging Kimberly into a violent confrontation. He described Matthew as a jealous, abusive husband who couldn't accept that Kimberly had moved on. 2 men. 2 guns. 2 stories that couldn't both be true. Back in Ray Township, word of the shooting spread like wildfire. Neighbors huddled together, replaying what they had heard. Some remembered the sound of tires screeching down the road. Others swore they had heard yelling before the shots rang out. One man even said he saw a Jeep speeding past his house, headlights off, before chaos erupted. It was as though the entire community had been thrust into a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. By the end of the night, detectives had secured both suspects. But the question of guilt was nowhere near solved. Instead, all they had were fragments of a story, fragments that hinted at years of buried secrets. Why had Kimberly been caught in the middle of 2 armed men? Why had she been left fighting for her life, while both Matthew and Daniel insisted they were the true victims? As police worked through the conflicting accounts, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't just a case of violence. This was the explosion of something that had been boiling for years. And soon, investigators would discover the truth. A truth tied to betrayal, obsession, and a forbidden love triangle that had pushed everyone to the brink. The gunfire had spread, But the real shock was yet to come. By the early morning hours, the flashing lights were gone, but the shock still lingered in Ray Township. What had started as a normal Saturday night had spiraled into a nightmare, a woman clinging to life, and two men sitting in custody, each claiming they weren't the aggressor. Detectives knew the only way forward was to start connecting the dots. Both Matthew and Daniel were questioned separately, and both painted themselves as victims. But investigators also needed the voices of those who had witnessed the chaos firsthand. The first key testimony came from a neighbor named Brendan Serra. He had been sitting in his living room when the commotion started. The sound of gunfire made him freeze, but curiosity pulled him to his window. What he saw next would haunt him for years. Brendan described hearing what sounded like rapid gunshots, followed by the screech of tires. Then, a jeep appeared in front of his house. He could see flashes, bursts of light from a gun being fired inside the moving vehicle. In the confusion, he realized it was Kimberly's jeep. Someone was shooting out the window, Brendan later told detectives. It looked like the husband. It was chaos. I didn't even know what direction the bullets were going. His account added weight to the suspicion that Matthew had been more than just a bystander. But as investigators pressed further, Brendan mentioned something else. He had heard voices arguing before the shots. He couldn't make out the words, but the shouting sounded personal, not random. That detail was critical. This wasn't a simple shooting. This was something driven by rage, betrayal, and long-standing resentment. Meanwhile, Kimberly remained in critical condition at the hospital. Doctors worked tirelessly, but her wounds were devastating. Detectives prayed she might wake up and give her own account, but the odds were slim. For now, her silence left a void, one that both men were eager to fill with their own versions of the truth. As questioning continued, Matthew grew increasingly agitated. His story shifted with each retelling. At first, he claimed Kimberly had been driving the jeep when they were ambushed by Daniel. Minutes later, he changed his statement, saying he was the one behind the wheel. The inconsistencies only fueled suspicion. Daniel, on the other hand, stuck to his narrative. From his hospital bed, he insisted Matthew had stormed onto his property, firing without warning. He painted himself as a man under attack, a man forced to defend his home. 2 men, 2 weapons, and a woman who couldn't speak for herself. For detectives, the contradictions were maddening. But there was a bigger piece of the puzzle they hadn't yet confronted, the relationships that tied these 3 people together. Why had Kimberly and Matthew shown up at Daniel's house that night? Why had tensions escalated so quickly that bullets began flying? The answer began to emerge when detectives started digging into the history between the 3 of them. Friends and neighbors were hesitant at first, but whispers soon turned into confessions. People admitted there had long been rumors about Kimberly and Daniel, rumors that went far beyond friendship. One neighbor recalled seeing Kimberly and Daniel together often, sometimes in ways that felt too close. Another hinted that Matthew had grown paranoid in recent months, watching Kimberly closely, asking too many questions about her whereabouts. It was becoming clear that this case wasn't just about violence. It was about betrayal, about love twisted into obsession. As detectives pieced together the background, the image sharpened. Kimberly and Daniel had once been involved in an affair. And although both men now swore it was over, the tension from that relationship still burned hot. That revelation changed everything. Suddenly, the gunfight in Ray Township wasn't just random violence. It was the violent eruption of years of secrets hidden behind closed doors. But which man was telling the truth? Was Matthew the jealous husband who had finally snapped, showing up at Daniel's house with a gun? Or was Daniel the manipulator, the man who had never let go of Kimberly, and now fired in a desperate attempt to keep her from leaving? Detectives knew they were standing on the edge of a storm. The testimonies were conflicting, the evidence was mounting, and the small town was buzzing with rumors. Everyone had an opinion, but nobody had the full story. And as Kimberly's fate hung in the balance, investigators braced themselves for the next shocking revelation, one that would expose just how deep the betrayal really ran. Because this wasn't just a love triangle. This was a ticking time bomb that had finally exploded. 4 days after the shooting, detectives worked around the clock, combing through every shred of evidence and every word spoken by Matthew and Daniel. Both men clung to their versions of the truth, each portraying himself as the victim. But investigators knew that the real answers lay buried in the past, in the secret relationship that had tied all three lives together. When Matthew was brought back into the interrogation room, he was pale, exhausted, and defensive. He sat across from detectives with his arms crossed tightly, as if protecting himself from what was coming. Then, with a deep breath, he admitted something he had avoided for years. Kimberly, his wife of nearly a decade, had been having an affair. Her lover, none other than Daniel, the same man who now sat in a hospital bed recovering from a gunshot wound. According to Matthew, the affair wasn't recent. It had gone on for years, 9 years to be exact. Nearly a decade of betrayal hidden behind polite smiles, friendly conversations, and neighborhood small talk. He claimed Kimberly had strayed from him long ago and that Daniel had never let her go. Detectives listened carefully, noting the bitterness in Matthew's voice. He spoke not just like a victim of a crime, but like a man humiliated and enraged by years of deception. His story suggested that October 6th had been the breaking point, the night he confronted the man who had stolen his wife. But when investigators confronted Daniel with Matthew's version of events, his reaction was immediate. He shook his head, wincing at the pain in his leg, and flatly denied the 9-year timeline. Yes, he admitted, he and Kimberly had once been romantically involved. But in his telling, the affair had ended years earlier, 2 years, to be exact. He insisted they had gone their separate ways, that Kimberly had returned to her husband, and that he had moved on. For detectives, the contradiction was striking. 9 years or 2 years, either way, the affair had been real. But the truth about when it ended, or whether it had ever truly ended, remained murky. More importantly, it explained the hatred boiling between the two men. This wasn't just about a fight gone wrong. This was about betrayal that had festered for nearly a decade. The more detectives dug, the clearer it became that both men were twisting the truth to suit their own narratives. Matthew wanted to paint Daniel as an obsessive outsider who had clung to Kimberly and refused to let her go. Daniel wanted to portray Matthew as an abusive, jealous husband who couldn't stand that his wife had once chosen another man. And in the middle of it all was Kimberly, the only person who truly knew the full story. But she was lying in a hospital bed, unconscious, her body broken by bullets, unable to defend herself or explain her choices. Friends of Kimberly, however, began to fill in the blanks. They spoke quietly, some reluctantly, about what they had seen over the years. Many confirmed that Kimberly and Daniel's relationship had been far more than friendship. They recalled the way the two would sneak glances at each other at gatherings, or how Kimberly sometimes disappeared for long stretches of time without clear explanations. Others spoke about Matthew, about the anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior, about the way he sometimes spoke about Kimberly as if she were his possession rather than his partner. One close friend even admitted Kimberly had once confided in her, saying she feared Matthew might hurt her if he ever discovered the full truth. These revelations painted a chilling picture. The affair wasn't just a secret. It was a dangerous fault line, one that had been threatening to crack wide open for years. By October 6th, it finally did. Detectives now faced a critical question. Who pulled the trigger first? Was Matthew the aggressor, consumed by jealousy and rage? Or was Daniel the one who reignited old passions, pushing Matthew into a spiral of violence? Both men clung desperately to their stories. Matthew swore he had only fired in self-defense, after Daniel ambushed him and Kimberly. Daniel claimed he was the one under siege, a victim in his own home. But detectives weren't convinced by words alone. They needed something concrete, something irrefutable. And soon, they would find it. A piece of evidence that would cut through the lies and expose the truth about that night. For now, though, the story of Kimberly, Matthew, and Daniel was a tale of betrayal, obsession, and jealousy so deep it turned neighbors into enemies. A love triangle hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment it would erupt into violence. And on that October night, it finally had. As detectives sifted through the conflicting stories, one thing became clear: words alone weren't enough. Matthew and Daniel had woven such different versions of events that it was impossible to know who was telling the truth. The case needed hard evidence, something that couldn't be twisted or spun. That evidence came in the form of surveillance cameras. Ray Township was a quiet community, but like many neighborhoods, several homes had security systems. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking residents if they had cameras pointed toward the street. One by one, they began to collect hours of footage. At first, It seemed like a long shot. But then, one camera revealed something critical. The footage showed a Jeep driving past on the night of the shooting, Kimberly's Jeep. What caught investigators' eyes, however, wasn't just the vehicle. It was what was happening inside it. Clear as day, the video showed the passenger side window rolling down. A man leaned out, gun in hand, firing into the night. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets were discharged from the moving car. That man was Matthew. The revelation hit detectives like a hammer. For days, Matthew had insisted he was either driving defensively or being ambushed. But here was proof. He had actively fired from the Jeep while Kimberly was in the car beside him. The image of him leaning out of the window, weapon drawn, contradicted nearly every claim he had made. When confronted with the footage, Matthew grew defensive. He stammered, his story shifting yet again. At first, he claimed Kimberly had been the one driving while he returned fire in panic. Then, minutes later, he contradicted himself, saying he might have been driving after all. The inconsistencies were piling up, and the surveillance tape left little doubt. Matthew hadn't just been defending himself. He had taken the fight directly to Daniel. Detectives now had to weigh Matthew's lies against Daniel's account. And while Daniel certainly wasn't innocent, he had been armed and had fired as well. His story was beginning to align more closely with the physical evidence. The surveillance video wasn't the only problem for Matthew. Ballistic analysis confirmed that multiple shots had come from his gun, and their trajectory matched the direction of fire from the Jeep. This meant Matthew hadn't simply responded to an attack. He had engaged in a moving gun battle with his wife beside him. The more evidence surfaced, the clearer the picture became. Matthew had driven to Daniel's house that night with Kimberly. A confrontation had erupted. Shots were fired. But rather than retreat, Matthew escalated the violence, pulling the trigger while trapped in a web of jealousy, betrayal, and rage. Detectives also took a closer look at Matthew's behavior immediately after the shooting. Witnesses recalled how, instead of focusing on Kimberly's injuries, he had shouted angrily at officers, insisting Daniel was the true villain. His obsession with proving Daniel guilty overshadowed any genuine concern for his wife's survival. And yet, despite all this, Matthew continued to deny responsibility. He insisted the footage was being misinterpreted, that he had no choice but to fire, that Daniel had been the aggressor from the very beginning. But the cracks in his story were impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Daniel's statements remained consistent. He admitted to firing his weapon but maintained it was only after Matthew opened fire first. And while Daniel's credibility was far from perfect, the video evidence gave his account more weight than Matthew's ever-shifting narrative. The case was no longer just about two men claiming self-defense. It was about which of them had escalated a volatile situation into outright carnage. And increasingly, all signs pointed to Matthew. As detectives pieced the story together, one horrifying truth stood out. In his rage, Matthew had risked everything: his wife's safety, his own freedom, and the peace of an entire community. He had turned a quiet street into a war zone, and in doing so, he had left Kimberly bleeding in the crossfire. The surveillance footage was the turning point. What had once been a case clouded in confusion was now beginning to take shape. But detectives weren't finished. There was still one more voice to be heard, a voice that would strip away Matthew's defenses completely and reveal the darkness that had been building long before that October night. Because while the cameras had captured the violence, someone else had captured the truth about what Kimberly had been living through for years. And when that truth came out, the entire case would shift forever. The surveillance footage had already shaken the foundation of Matthew's defense. But as prosecutors prepared for trial, they knew video evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed to establish motive, pattern, and intent. And that's when Kimberly's closest friend stepped forward. Her name was Lori. She had been Kimberly's confidant for years, the person Kim turned to whenever the weight of her marriage became unbearable. In emotional testimony, Lori described a chilling reality hidden behind the walls of the Gill home. According to her, Kimberly had been living in fear. She confided that Matthew was controlling, unpredictable, and at times, frightening. Arguments often escalated, leaving Kimberly anxious about what might come next. Just weeks before the shooting, Kimberly told Lori she was terrified of her husband's temper and felt trapped in a marriage she could no longer endure. She said she was afraid Matthew would kill her one day, Lori told investigators. Those words sent a shiver through the courtroom when they were repeated at trial. They painted a harrowing picture. Kimberly wasn't simply caught in the crossfire of a lover's quarrel. She had been a woman trying to escape a relationship she believed might end her life. With Laurie's testimony, prosecutors built their narrative. Matthew wasn't a desperate husband caught off guard by betrayal. He was a man consumed by jealousy and anger, determined to confront his wife's former lover at any cost. And in that blind rage, he unleashed a chain of events that led to Kimberly's death. But there was one more devastating revelation. Forensic evidence confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The bullet that ended Kimberly's life didn't come from Matthew's gun. It came from Daniel's. The courtroom fell silent when the medical examiner explained the trajectory of the fatal shot. Daniel, in the chaos of returning fire, had delivered the wound that killed Kimberly. It was a cruel irony. The man who claimed to still care for her had been the one who fired the deadly shot. But prosecutors argued this didn't absolve Matthew. If anything, it cemented his guilt. By initiating the violent confrontation, by pulling the trigger first, Matthew had set into motion the very events that guaranteed tragedy. Kimberly had become collateral damage in a battle fueled by ego, betrayal, and rage. The jury had to answer two haunting questions. Who was truly responsible? And did either man have a legal right to claim self-defense? When the verdict was read, the weight of the tragedy hung heavy in the air. Matthew Gill was found guilty of multiple charges, including second-degree murder. The surveillance footage, his inconsistent statements, and the testimony about his controlling behavior convinced the jury that he had crossed the line from protection to aggression. He hadn't been defending himself. He had been hunting down a rival. Daniel, however, was found not guilty of murder. The court accepted his claim of self-defense, acknowledging that while his bullet had killed Kimberly, he had been responding to Matthew's attack. It was a narrow, almost unbearable distinction, but in the eyes of the law, Daniel had not started the fight. The verdict split the community. Some believed both men should have been held accountable for Kimberly's death. Others felt justice had been served, that Matthew alone had ignited the firestorm, and Daniel had simply reacted. But no matter where anyone stood, one truth was undeniable. Kimberly was gone, and nothing could bring her back. In the aftermath, friends and family struggled to process what had happened. Kimberly's children were left without a mother. A small Michigan town was scarred by violence it had never imagined. And two families were forever broken, linked together by grief and blame. Looking back, the tragedy of that October night wasn't just about bullets and betrayal. It was about years of secrets, of hidden fears, of a marriage unraveling behind closed doors. It was about two men so blinded by jealousy and pride that they never stopped to see the real cost of their war. Kimberly's story became more than just a headline. It became a cautionary tale. A reminder that beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives, darkness can grow unchecked. And when anger and control replace trust and love, the consequences can be devastating. In the end, there were no winners. Only loss. Only questions that could never truly be answered. And a haunting reality that would echo through Ray Township for years to come. One night, in the quiet of a Michigan street, love turned into violence, and a woman caught in the middle paid the ultimate price.